Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Lovely to see you all here. As per the usual format, I've posted in the chat group the link to the downloads for anyone who didn't manage yet to download the source sheet. And I've also muted everyone, but please feel free to unmute yourselves if you want to ask anything or to use the chat function to ask anything. Now, this is part 2 of looking at Moshe's leadership and trying to understand with greater depth his mission to Paro and his role. Now, I want to really start off by looking at the same psukim as we looked at last week, from the beginning of, from Va'era. We will later on move to our Parsha, to Parshat Bo, but for now I want to start off looking at Moshe's debate or argument with Hashem, in which he attempts to refuse his mission. He doesn't believe it will be successful, he can't see how it can work, and Hashem responds. And last week we looked at these psukim, which are very, very difficult and hard to understand. It's not at all clear what his claim and conversation with Hashem is really about. Last week we looked at some of the textual difficulties from Rashi's perspective, or we looked at some of the difficulties and then Rashi's answer to the question. And this week I want to look at an alternative reading of the psukim, which is very radical and unexpected and unusual. And unless one has heard this idea before, I think a complete surprise in understanding what's going on. So let's just do a brief review again of the psukim that we looked at last week, and then we'll try and understand them anew. And again, I've posted in the chat group the handout source sheet for those who want it. This week it's pretty important to be able to see as much as possible from these psukim inside. So the verses start in chapter 6. Very briefly, the first paragraph, I've separated it off into paragraphs. The first paragraph, psukim Aleph, number pasuk 1 of chapter 6 to pasuk 9, is Moshe being instructed by Hashem to go and speak to the Jewish people. Last week, Cedra, to let them know that they will be released, and they don't listen. They're skeptical about Moshe's mission. They don't listen to him. Pasuk 10, Hashem then instructs Moshe to go and speak to Paro, and Moshe responds in pasuk 12, if the Jewish people aren't going to listen to me, how much more so Paro isn't going to listen to me. Va'ani aral safasayim. I am uncircumcised of speech. In other cases, he talks about being heavy, kavad peh. He has a heavy mouth. And we discussed last week the idea behind Moshe's refusal to accept this mission and his speech struggles or even disabilities. Now, in Pasuk Yud Gimel, Aaron suddenly appears on the scene. And Pasuk Yud Gimel, Pasuk 13, we do need to look at with care. Vayadaber Hashem el Moshe vel Aaron. Hashem spoke to Moshe and Aaron. Vayatzaveim el bnei Yisrael vel Paro melech Mitzrayim. And he commanded them, el bnei Yisrael, ve'el Paro melech Mitzrayim, to the children of Israel and to Paro, the king of Egypt. Again, for those who have just joined, I've posted the source sheet and the link on the chat group. Pasuk Yud Gimel, really important to see inside. He commands Moshe and Aaron. What's Aaron doing here? Why did Aaron come onto the scene? And he commands them to Bnei Israel and to Paro melech Mitzrayim. To do what? L'hotz yes Bnei Israel me'eretz Mitzrayim, to take out the Jewish people from the land of Egypt. Now, there's two textual difficulties over here. The first problem is, why speak to the Jewish people to take them out of Egypt? Surely the message is to Paro. Now, you could answer this by saying, Vayatzaveim, he spoke about Bnei Israel, to tell them to say something to Paro melech Mitzrayim, translating the word el in this context, not meaning to speak to the Jewish people, but about the Jewish people and about Paro, the king of Egypt. And this is exactly how Rashi takes it. And there are other examples in Tanakh. It's not an unknown form in Tanakh where el doesn't mean to, but it means about, though this certainly isn't the natural understanding of it. Point number 1. Point number 2, the story then interrupts and tells us the yichus, the family tree of Moshe and Aaron. It tells us about Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. and where Aaron and Moshe appear on the family tree interrupts the story, very strange. And again, we saw Rashi's comments on this. Rashi understands this as a literary device. This often happens. You introduce characters and then you step back and say, by the way, I will fill you in a little bit on their background. This is how we saw last week Rashi learns it. Finally, we reach Psukim 26 and 27. And these have a structure that I mentioned last week when we learned, which is a very familiar literary structure in the Torah, in which something is structured in a mirror image radiating outwards. In fact, the whole Torah, by the way, has such a structure. There's a Yikra in the middle with Bereshit Shemos on one side and Mamid and Dvarim on the other. It's a very common literary device found many times in the Torah. And the classic form of this mirror image would be A, B, C, C, B, A. So it's like a mirror image. And here we have exactly such a structure. Let's look at Pasukim 26 and 27, in which we're reminded who Moshe and Aaron are. Who Aaron or Moshe? So there's three elements in Pasuk 26. Aaron, Moshe, and their mission to take the Jews out of Egypt. A, B, C. Aaron, Moshe, mission. Pasuk 27 has the same three elements, but now in reverse. These are the ones who had to speak to Paro, the king of Egypt, to take the Jews out, the mission. And this is Moshe and Aaron. So Pasuk 26 is Aaron, Moshe, mission. Pasuk 27 is mission, Moshe, Aaron, in reverse. Structure of mirror image, known as in literary devices, a chiasma. So this is a second aspect of the Psukim, this repetitive nature, difficult to understand what it's doing. Pasuk 26 and 27 seem to say the identical thing. This is Moshe and Aaron given the mission to take them out, and then it's repeated again in mirror form. Finally, in Pasuk 27, we have a very familiar term used in which the Jewish people are referred to as leaving Egypt, al tzivosom, Pasuk 26. In their tzava formation, in their, it's often translated as the hosts. In modern Hebrew, of course, tzava is an army. In classical Hebrew, it's also used sometimes as an army. Translated as a host. They leave Egypt al tzivosom, as an army or in hosts, in legions, in an orderly manner. And this is a theme, again, that crops up again and again in the story of leaving Egypt, that they leave al tzivosom in an orderly manner. So what's going on over here? What are we meant to make of this protracted conversation between Hashem and Moshe, the appointment of Aaron to somehow cope and complement Moshe's weakness, his kavad peh, his inability or struggles with communicating. Aaron is somehow appointed to resolve it, and then the doubling up of the language used in the Psukim. So we looked at all of this last week from Rashi's perspective. If you didn't manage to hear it, the recording is online. Rashi's reading the Psukim, a fascinating analysis, according to Rashi, of the development of Moshe's leadership. But I now want to share a completely different reading of the Meshech Chochmah, Ramei Simcha HaKohen of Dvinsk. I've often cited the Meshech Chochmah. He has a phenomenal and beautiful commentary on the Torah. He was born in the mid-1800s, died in the 1920s. He was the Rav of Dvinsk. He wrote a very important commentary on the Rambam's Mishnah Torah called the Or Sameach, and he also wrote his commentary on the Torah called the Meshech Chochmah. Both of them indicate his name. Sameach is his initials of his name, Shin Mem Ches, Meir Simcha, and Meshech Chochmah again, Mem Shin Kaf, Meir Simcha Kohen or HaKohen. His commentary on the Torah is very unusual. It's exceptionally original, and it combines in-depth knowledge of grammar, insights based in Pashat and Parshanut, insights based on Kabbalah, Halacha, and philosophy. To the best of my knowledge, it's the last work that is so broad, sweeping, and wide-ranging, in which you have a master halachist, master grammarian, Kabbalist, and philosopher rolled into one. And he writes a beautiful commentary on the Torah, and I want to share what he does with all of these questions. And the basic idea he puts forward, and we'll see this inside how he reads this, is that in the time of exile in Egypt, the 200 plus years, inevitably there's movement amongst the Jewish population. Things aren't static. And some Jews achieve freedom. Some Jews are freed by their Egyptian masters, or perhaps they earn their way out of slavery. We find a similar phenomenon, of course, in other slave cultures, like the southern states of America. There are some slaves who achieve freedom. Now, what do they do when they earn their way? What do they do when they become free? And the tragic answer to the question, and we'll see later the Rameh Simcha Cohen, the Meshech Chochmah's evidence of this, is that some of them end up buying slaves themselves, buying Jewish slaves. And again, we see the same phenomenon in other slave cultures, like the southern states of America. Because what does a slave dream of when he's enslaved? Tragically, he dreams of becoming like his master. And the Jewish slaves in Egypt buy into the Egyptian dream. What are they dreaming of when they're slaves? Maybe one day I'll be free. And what does freedom mean to me? It means to be like an Egyptian, to be like an Egyptian overlord, to be like an Egyptian master. So I aspire to having the Egyptian dream, to having the good Egyptian life. What does it mean to have the good Egyptian life? To do what Egyptians do. And part of being an Egyptian and a wealthy individual is yourself to own slaves. So this is a tragedy, and this is a step further in the idea that we already saw alluded in Rashi, that the Jews become enslaved. It's not just that they happen to be slaves, but they become enslaved. They don't just, as Rashi takes it, get a slave mentality, but they become so assimilated into Egyptian culture, as Chazal teach us. They keep only a few very basic identifying features of their Jewish heritage and ancestry, that they aspire to the Egyptian Jew, and some of them, when they become free, themselves become slave owners. Where does Rameh Simcha get this idea from? Well, the answer is he reads the Psukim, and he reads Psukim well. He reads the simplest version of Pasuk Yud Gimel, Pasuk 13, that we struggle to understand. And yet, this is what the Pasuk says, if our eyes are opened to the Psukim. Let's look back again at Pasuk Yud Gimel, at Pasuk 13, in Rameh Simcha's version of the Psukim. Says the Pasuk Yud Gimel, Vayadaber Hashem el Moshe el Aaron. Hashem spoke to Moshe and Aaron, Vayetzavim, and he commanded them, El Bnei Yisrael vel Paro melech Mitzrayim, to speak to Bnei Yisrael and to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, L'hotzias Bnei Yisrael melech Mitzrayim, to release the Bnei Yisrael from the land of Egypt. In other words, he has to address Paro, but he also has to address at least some Jews to let the Jews go from slavery. They're also targets of Moshe, to be addressed and to be told, you also need to let your slaves go free. And this is greater depth into what Moshe says to Hashem in Pasuk 12. Get back at Pasuk 12. Moshe spoke to Hashem, Pasuk Yud Beis, Vaydaber Moshe l'fnei Hashem Neimar, Hein b'nei Yisrael lo shamer elai. The Jewish people didn't listen to me. Ve'ech yishmeini Paro v'ani al sfasayim. How will Paro listen to me? The Jews didn't listen to me in terms of my message to them. When I spoke to Paro and I'm trying to convince him there's something wrong with owning slaves, what can I do if even Klal Yisrael, even the Jewish people who have slaves, don't listen to me? They're also immersed in the words of Chazal, in the Mem Shari Tumah. They're also immersed. I can't speak to the Jews. I can't inspire them, never mind Paro. And therefore, says Moshe, I need an Aaron. I need the assistance of Aaron. And Aaron will be the inspirer of the Jews. Aaron will know how to speak to the Jews. And this is why the Torah interrupts with the family tree, because we now need to understand who Moshe and Aaron are, and we need to understand their relationship with Klal Yisrael, with the Jewish people, and also uniquely the three Shavatim who are listed over here. And here Rameh Simcha suggests that when we look at the family tree, it only includes the three senior tribes, the tribes of Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven, who until the taking over of his role by Yehuda later on in the Torah, is the senior tribe. Shimon, the second tribe, and Levi, who at least according to Chazal were never enslaved at all. So who are the nobles of the Jewish people who have particularly transgressed and ended up buying slaves themselves? Perhaps Reuven, Shimon, and Levi themselves. But what is the division of labor between Moshe and Aaron in this mission? To perhaps the chief culprits in enslaving, who perhaps are Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. This is where we need to learn Pasuk 29. Moshe turns to Hashem and he says, there's two things I can't do. Oh, sorry, Pasuk. Or if we look at Pasuk 12 again, Moshe says to Hashem, I'm unable to speak to the Bnei Israel, and I'm unable to speak to Paro. Why can't I speak to Bnei Israel? Because they won't listen to me. I can't inspire them to realize that they're falling into the trap of themselves immersion in Egyptian culture to the degree that perhaps they're even owning slaves. And I can't speak to Paro, who also doesn't want to listen to me either. And Hashem's response is, I'm going to give you Aaron as your assistant, but Aaron's assistance isn't symmetrical. In the mission to the Jewish people, to Yisrael, Aaron is the main one. In a moment, we'll see why. In the mission to Paro, you, Moshe, are the main one. Let's look at verses 26 and 27, which, as we saw, doubled up in this mirror image. Who are Aaron and Moshe? This is Aaron and Moshe. Who comes first? Aaron. The main one here is Aaron. Take the Jewish people out of Egypt. Your mission is to the Jews, to take them out of Egypt. How so? Of course, by the Egyptians need to let them go. But you need to speak to the Jewish people. And a second role is, they're also the ones that need to speak to Paro, who Moshe and Aaron. And in that role, it's primarily Moshe first, and Aaron is the assistant. So we have two pasukim in Rameh Simcha's reading. A mission to the Jewish people, in which Aaron is the main one, and Moshe is his assistant, and a mission to Paro, in which Moshe is the main one, and Aaron is his assistant. So let's try and understand why and what's going on over here. In the mission to the Jews, Aaron is the main one. He's not just the deliverer or the repeater of Moshe's message, he's creative, he's the originator of the message. Aaron perhaps is uniquely equipped to do this. After all, he's Ohev Shalom, he's the peacemaker. He needs to truly inspire. Perhaps here Moshe's his inability to speak particularly holds him back. Speaking to Paro at the end of the day, it's delivering a brute message. Charisma isn't needed, but speaking to the Jewish people perhaps needs Aaron's ability to speak. And more than that, as the Torah repeats when it gives us a summary, perhaps Moshe, who grew up in Paro's house and then left Egypt, is perhaps less relatable to for other people. Perhaps the people don't know him as well. In fact, the leader of the Jewish people before Moshe appears on the scene most probably was Aaron, based upon how Chazal reads a different sequence of psukim that we're not going to look at today. It would appear that Aaron was the Jewish leader of the Jewish people. Part of Moshe's reluctance actually in Shemos to accept his mission is because he didn't want to upset Aaron by superseding his older brother. But Aaron is the one with the relationship to the Jewish people. He's the one with the ability to inspire. He's the one who has grown up and been part of their life, unlike Moshe, who is somewhat of a distant figure, who's grown up in the house of Paro, who's been away from the Jewish people for 80 years till he turns up back on the scene. He is the one who is able to speak to the Jewish people. In the mission to Paro, in contrast, there Moshe is the main one. He is the representative of Hashem, of Elokim. He's the one who is the one who has the responsibility to deliver the frightening message to Paro, the harsh message to Paro. And Aaron is just his mouthpiece. Aaron is just the one who needs to repeat what Moshe says to Paro in order to be the communicator. So these are the two pasukim, Pasuk Kaf Zayin, Pasuk Kaf Vav, and Pasuk Kaf Zayin, verse 26 and verse 27 in the reading of the Meshech Chochmah, two messages, two jobs. Pasuk 26, a message to the Jewish people, to take them out of Egypt. The role in which Hashem spoke in Pasuk 13 and said, speak El B'nai Israel, through the B'nai Israel, and there Aaron is the main one. And Pasuk 27, in which they need to speak to Paro. They both speak, but in this one, Moshe is the main one. Indeed, we see this later in the Psukim, in Pasuk 29 and 30, and then at the top of the next page, Pasuk 1 in chapter 7, Hashem says, Vayom Hashem al Moshe, Re'ena saticha lekim leparo. I've appointed you as a lekim, as a representative of God, perhaps, or perhaps as a force, a power, Elohim in the secular sense, a power, a judge. We know judges are also called Elohim, leparo. In that role, Aaron is just your prophet, your mouthpiece. You will speak. And Aaron will be the one who speaks to Paro v'shalachas b'nei Yisrael, and through that, Paro will eventually send away the Jewish people. In that mission to Paro, Aaron is just passive. He's the second one. He's just the mouthpiece of Moshe, who is the true judge and master over Paro, as opposed to in the mission to the Jewish people, where, as per Pasuk 26, who are in a Moshe, in that mission, Aaron is the dominant one, and Moshe is, in a sense, the junior partner. Finally, the Meshech Chochmah finishes off and says this helps us understand the language of Al Sivosom. They leave in their tzova, in their army, in their hosts, with dignity. Look at source 4 on page 2, describing them leaving Egypt and Al Sedra in Parshat Bo. Vayhi be'etzem hayom hazeh, hotzi Hashem es bnei Yisrael mitzrayim al sivosom, in their hosts, meaning that Moshe and Aaron succeeded in their mission. They left, as the Meshech Chochmah says, in a tzova, in an army, in a formation, in a unit, each one recognizing the role and the place and the position of the other, meaning that Moshe and Aaron had succeeded in their mission. The Shavatim, the tribes, had learned to respect each other's autonomy. They had learned to respect and understand the dignity and independent role of each person. And not only had Moshe and Aaron therefore succeeded in their mission to Paro to let the Jewish people go, but they had succeeded in their mission to the Jewish people to let their own slaves go, for them to learn to take the Egypt out of themselves. So I just want to conclude by having a very brief look at the Meshech Chochmah inside. I've printed this at the top of source 3 on page 2, on the second page of the handout. Vayitzavim el b'nei Yisrael vel Paro melech Mitzrayim. This is Pasuk 13. Yitochin, he says it's possible. Ki gam oz b'Mitzrayim hayu gedolei ha'umah. Even then in Egypt there were powerful figures, ashar yusorim nechbodim, who are great lords, v'efratim and nobles. There's always going to be, even in a slave culture, independent people who have somehow the luck or the fortune or the skill, even as slaves, to eventually achieve freedom, to create their own wealth, and tragically end up enslaving their own brethren because they're brought into the Egyptian dream. Perhaps, maybe these are the 3 Shavatim, who are the ones who achieved rulership in Mitzrayim, and that's how the Meshech Chochmah explains the interruption of the story in verses 14 to 23. Eilu Roshei Avos, these are referred to as the Roshei Avos. Look in those psukim, they're the heads of the household. It's at this stage that they achieve dominance over their brothers. And then the Meshech Chochmah carries on in the section entitled Dual Mission in the English. On Messiah, who are in a Moshe Shomar Shalem Hutzias Bnei Yisrael Mitzrayim or Tzivosom. Tzivosom, he picks up. This is their dual mission. Tzivosom means their army units, their hosts. Shir kol mishpacha v'shevet sova b'fnei atzmo. Each person, each tribe has their own dignity, their own independence. They leave in a dignified manner of Tzivosom, not anymore as ex-slaves and ex-slave holders. And finally, he finishes off citing a sequence of psukim in Yirmiyahu, and this is these psukim I want to read inside, and we will then finish off. This is the bottom of the quote from the Meshech Chochmah on page 2 in the handout. So I put this in bold. Use a sequence of psukim. Koma Mama Hashem, Anochi Kanti Bris Isavosechem B'Yom Hotzios HaMeretz Mitzrayim Mibeis Avodim. I sealed a covenant, by the way, not mentioned clearly in the Torah, with your ancestors when they left Egypt, on the day they left Egypt. Lema is saying, and then the verse in Yirmiyah quotes the opening psukim in Mishpatim, which tells us that a Jew can't own another Jew as a slave. The most you can have is a bondsman who goes free after 6 years, etc. So this pasuk in Yirmiyah is saying something remarkable. When we learn the future Sedras, in Bo, the Jewish people leave Egypt. In Beshalach, the story of the Yom Suf, the splitting of the Dead Sea, occurs. In Yisro, there's the giving of the Torah. And then Mishpatim suddenly talks about the laws of interpersonal relationships and justice. And the first mitzvah opens with that a Jew can't own another Jew as a slave, only as a bondsman, for several years, after which they will go free. Says the pasuk in Yirmiyah, addressing the question, why is this the opening mitzvah given to the Jewish people straight after Yisro? And then at the end of Mishpatim, it goes back to the story of the giving of the Torah and the covenant that seals, something we've discussed on other occasions. The pasuk in Yirmiyah is the Novi Yirmiyah acting as a parsha, as a perush, as a commentary on the Chumash. So we think of the earliest commentaries we have. We have the Rishonim, the Ramban, Rashi, we have the Gemara. Here we have Yirmiyah explaining the Pesukim in the Torah. And he says, what's going on in Mishpatim? Why is the first mitzvah the Jews need to be taught about slave ownership of other Jews? Says the Pasuk in Yirmiyah, because this is the first message I had to teach the Jewish people. The Yom Hotzio Samei Etz Mitzrayim, on the day that I took them out of the lands of Egypt, I sealed a covenant with them. No more should another Jew, one Jew, own another Jew. So this is the Psukim in Yirmiyah chapter 34, and this is the beautiful and remarkable insight of the Meshech Chochmah in reading the Psukim, a completely original reading. The Psukim in yet one that fits so perfectly the nuance of language. The Jewish people have tragically immersed themselves so much in Egypt that they have lost al tzivosom. They have lost that mutual respect to each other and have ended up as slave owners. They need to be taught the wrongs of slave ownership themselves. You need two missions to the Jewish people. Moshe and Aaron in one mission, in which Aaron is the dominant one, trying to lead and inspire the Jews to take the Egypt out of themselves. And secondly, Moshe and Aaron, in which Moshe is the dominant one, speaking to Paro, which is just the delivery of the brute raw message, let the Jewish people go. Also, obviously, a pertinent mussar to all of us on a practical level. To what degree, when we are immersed in a dominant culture, have we forgotten ourselves? To what degree have we brought in to not the Egyptian dream, as they had, but to the dream of the cultures around us? Many wonderful things. Baruch Hashem, we live in a Malchus Shel Chesed, in an incredible country with enormous virtues and positivity, but perhaps also areas in which we need to reflect ourselves, whether we need to step back a little bit and think about what we've perhaps absorbed, much like an Aaron had to speak to the Jewish people and say to them, have you become more Egyptianized than perhaps you realize and is right? So this is the idea of the Psukim. Yes, I mean, someone just posted me something which to the best of my knowledge absolutely is true. Someone wrote to me off group on the chat, that the first Jews who arrived in Rome long before the Churban Beis HaMikdash, about 200 years before the destruction of the temple, they arrived in Rome and they flourished, they prospered, and they freed many of the newly arrived brethren from slavery. That is correct. And throughout Jewish history, this has been a remarkable feature of Pidyon Shavurim, of redeeming those who have been enslaved. I'll stop there for the Parsha, and we'll move for today to our halachic analysis, to our halachic section, discussion. And we are dealing with the halachas of Bishul, the halachas of cooking on Shabbos. As I said last week, perhaps the most central area of halacha today in Hilchas Shabbos, a paradox in Hilchas Shabbos, that on the one hand, we need to have warm food on Shabbos, and yet on the other hand, this is the most prevalent malacha that we meet in the kitchen. Now, I would like to use the time available today to speak about two sorts of topics. The first is to finish off defining terms. Last week, we began speaking about some of the major concepts that we are going to meet in Hilchos Shabbos, and I would like to carry on doing that. And the second thing I'd like to do is answer a question that was posted to me on the chat group as to which fire or heat elements does the malacha of Bishul apply to. So let's just remind ourselves of some of the basic terminology and halachic concepts which I discussed last week. The first one is we spoke about what Bishul, what cooking means. It means application of heat to change the state of the object being cooked, whether softening, as takes place in some cooking, or hardening, as takes place in other. For example, baking dough hardens, cooking potatoes softens. And this is sometimes applicable, though not commonly so in day-to-day life, to non-food items such as perhaps baking a brick in the kiln or the like. So changing the physical structure, or another sort of significant change, such as making raw food edible, this would be the melacha of Bishul. This is number one. What is the threshold of Bishul? When is the crucial transition point to introduce the concept of Machul ben Drosoi? Ben Drosoi, I'll remind you, was this bandit who eats food in a rush, and he lends his name to the Gemara use of fast food. When the Gemara wants to talk about food cooked to the minimum necessary just to make it edible, it calls it Machul ben Drosoi, the food of this ben Drosoi, this bandit who was on the run during the Gemara, the Mishnaic era. And this is when food is barely edible, and there's discussion, which I'm not going to go into now, about what level of cooking is. It's perhaps a third or half of fully cooked. And at least as far as Torah law is concerned, that is the threshold with solid items. Once something is fully cooked, then further cooking is certainly not a transgression of Torah law, though there may be rabbinic issues involved over here. So, for example, if you have a cooked potato that's perfectly edible now, even though cooking it further may be nice for it, may make it better, that wouldn't be the Torah cooking. This is with solid foods. In contrast with liquids, there often isn't a change of state, but just heating a liquid is a significant change as far as halacha is concerned. Hot water is very different to cold water. Hot chicken soup is very different to cold chicken soup. And therefore, with liquids, the criteria is heat, measured by yad soledes, which literally means when the hand draws back. And we spoke last week about some experiments. I don't know if anyone did the homework, and experiments with the different levels of heat that we discussed last week, but somewhere around 43, 45 degrees is the point at which most people find that their hand instinctively feels something as hot, considerably lower than the temperature actually that we drink things at. It's a bit of a paradox. We think our mouths are much more sensitive than our hands, but actually when it comes to heat, we like drinking things above yad soledes. When we generally use hot water on a comfortable level, just washing our hands, we will generally use below yad soledes. Okay, so these are the ideas that we discussed last week, and again, the recording is available online for those who didn't manage to hear it. I want to mention a couple more concepts before we discuss heat sources. The next concept is, even in a situation in which something is anyway cooking, one has to be careful not to do not lamaher bishul, not to accelerate or speed up the cooking that occurs. And this is something that is very relevant in practical halacha. Again, we will look at this in more detail in future weeks, but several examples of how one might speed up cooking. One example is moving something closer to the heat source. So if, for example, and we'll discuss when this is or isn't possible, but if, for example, you have uncooked stew, goulash or cholent on the pot, on the blech before Shabbos, and you wish to, you're planning to eat it the next morning, and over Shabbos, you notice it's not cooking that hot, that well, and you move it from one end of the blech to the other end of the blech where it's hotter, so that it's over the element or over the gas hob. If it wasn't cooked before Shabbos, one has sped up the cooking process, and this would be the malacha of Bishul. In other words, even though it was left over heat source and eventually it would cook in 15 hours, and I move it over the heat elements, it cooks in 2 hours, nonetheless, by speeding up the Bishul, I have transgressed this malacha. So that would be one example. A couple of other examples: putting a lid on a pot could be mihur bishul, speeding up cooking. Again, we're talking in cases where it was raw, and through so doing, I speed up the cooking. Stirring could be another way of speeding up bishul, because again, by mixing the contents, I cause it to cook faster. And removing some of the contents could be speeding up bishul, because obviously a smaller quantity, given a fixed flame, will cook faster because there's a smaller quantity and therefore less energy is needed. So there's less good there to absorb the energy. So speeding up cooking is another concept that we need to be aware of. And in particular, one aspect of this, which is known in halacha as megis or stirring. Stirring is an example of speeding up cooking. And because it's such a common example, there's a rabbinic prohibition associated with it, which includes even stirring fully cooked foods on the flame. And again, hopefully we will revisit these scenarios. So just to summarize what I've said so far, raw food, I emphasize, raw food where I speed up the bishul is potentially bishul min haTorah, is the transgression of the malacha of cooking on Shabbos by speeding it up, such as stirring, reducing the content, moving it nearer the element, or putting the lid on it. One particular form of speeding up cooking, stirring, has a rabbinic addition associated with it, which is even stirring fully cooked foods on the flame. So even though it's fully cooked, and therefore, in essence, once it's cooked, and there shouldn't be a problem with stirring it. Nonetheless, midrabanan, stirring was added because this is a very prevalent way of moving food, is speeding up the cooking process. I should also mention in this context that megis, stirring, is only in essence applicable to solids, but not to liquids. And the reason for this is because there's two reasons, obviously, that we stir food. One reason is because we want it to mix, and the other reason is in order to distribute heat more equally. Now, with solids, that is the primary reason for stirring, or one of the primary reasons for stirring, because you want to move the food around so that the heat is evenly distributed. The food at the top doesn't have as much access, doesn't get as much heat as the food at the bottom, just above the gas or the element, and therefore you mix it. With liquids, where there's natural convection currents, mixing is minimal and of insignificant effect to the distribution of the heat, and perhaps has no effect or certainly minimal effect, and therefore the prohibition of megis doesn't apply to clear liquids and only applies to solid. So these are another couple of principles which we will need to learn over the next few weeks. Finally, one other core distinction that will conclude for today the definition of terms that I wanted to engage in before I speak about the heat sources is another difference between solids and liquids. So to summarize, we've spoken about two differences so far between solids and liquids. Difference number one is that solids are cooked by the change from raw to edible, or the change in the texture, hardening or softening, whereas liquids are cooked by heat, whether it's above or below yad solades. That's difference number one. Difference number two is with reference to stirring, a sort of a side difference. And now we get to difference number three, which is reheating. Now, once a solid is fully cooked, by definition, reheating it on Shabbos cannot be the Torah prohibition of cooking, because it's already cooked. In fact, not only once it's fully cooked, even if it's cooked to a point of good edibility, not just the fast food level of cooking of the bandit, Benjol soy, once it's cooked to a normal level that people would eat it, as far as Torah law is concerned, it's cooked. Once it's cooked, there's no further issue with further cooking it, even though the cooking might improve it. Now, nonetheless, rabbinically, there are many drabbanans associated with putting solids back onto a heat source, and over the next few weeks, we will discuss those. But at least as far as Torah law is concerned, once it's cooked, ein bishul, acha bishul, it's cooked, and therefore no further cooking can occur. If it's baked, no further baking can occur. This is with solids. With liquids, however, where the core definition of the cooking is that it's hot, if it cools down, this reverses the cooking that has occurred because it's now cool. So the fact that the water was once upon a time boiled is irrelevant if it's now cold, because it's no longer hot water. And with liquids, the crucial distinction is it hot or cold? So a liquid which is cold, as cold water, once the liquid is hot, above yad solades, it's nice hot liquid. And therefore with liquids, there is a concern with cooking after cooking, such that if my soup has cooled down, I can't put it back on the flame on Shabbos, even though the soup was already cooked or the water was already cooked, because it's now cooled down, and putting it back on the flame is re-cooking it. So just to reiterate, with solids, once cooked, it's cooked. Once baked, it's baked. As far as Torah law, that's it. We will see that there are various rabbinic conditions when you put it back, such as a blech and things like that. And these are to serve as a reminder, to ensure that one doesn't alter the gas level, to ensure that the external observer doesn't think that one is cooking. These are the rabbanans with parameters put in place to ensure that one reheats the food appropriately. But in principle, one can reheat solid foods. Liquids, however, the significance of cooking with liquids is the heat. And therefore, once the liquid has cooled down, one can't put it back on the heat source, even though one has a blech, and even though one does all the other things that one normally does to allow putting things back on the heat source, because it's cooled down, and therefore I am reheating it. Now, I should say over here that, in a sense, I'm simplifying the issue. There's a very important argument between the Shulchan Aruch, the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, who paskins for Sfaradim, and the Ramah, Moshe Isserlis of Krakow, who paskins for Ashkenazim as to exactly how to conceptualize this difference between solids and liquids, and to whether this is a distinction which is Torah or rabbinic. But in terms of practical halacha, in practice, once water has cooled down, everyone would agree that reheating it is a problem, even if I do the normal blech and other rules in place, because the significant cooking that takes place is the change from cold to hot. That would be agreed upon by both Ashkenazim and Sephardi poskim, even though, as I said, there are differences in how to conceptualize the melacha in the difference in detail. So, to summarize what we have said so far, we've spoken about the core halachic principles, the concept of what defines Bishul, the difference between the Bishul of a solid and a liquid in terms of the threshold crossed. Is it edibility or is it heat? And the ramification of that in terms of reheating liquids versus solids. And then we've spoken about speeding up cooking, and in particular, the example of megis, of stirring. These principles, broadly speaking, will be enough to help us navigate Torah law of Bishul. However, there are a vast number of drabonons associated with Bishul, and we'll need to work our way through these over the next few weeks. And there's an obvious reason why there are so many rabbinic rules around Bishul, more than any other melacha, because as I already said, this is no doubt the melacha one encounters most on Shabbos, with the possible exception of carrying. When we learned writing and building and dyeing on Shabbos, the question sort of was, why are we learning these halachas? Who does this? And I tried to show how these examples were relevant. But when it comes to cooking, we all understand these halachas that we need to know thoroughly. And because of the room for confusion, Chazal built a protocol as to how to run the Shabbos kitchen, and therefore built up various drabonons. I'm not going to go through all of these now, but these are the ones that we will learn over the next few weeks, including, unusually, some drabonons around things that we do before Shabbos also. Normally speaking, once you do something before Shabbos, you're in safe territory. Doesn't matter, as long as you set things in motion before Shabbos, doesn't matter what happens on Shabbos, as long as I've done everything before Shabbos. This is the exception when it comes to Bishul, that even rules about what I do before Shabbos in terms of my preparation for heating the food on Shabbos. So this is a general point of introduction to the halachas. And I now want to move on to a second very, very fascinating halachic discussion around the nature of the heat source that matters. And we will see how important and relevant this is to the halachas of Shabbos. We discussed what cooking means in terms of the outcome, the change in the object being cooked, whether because it becomes hot, cold to hot, or raw to cooked. But what now about the method of cooking? What can we say about that? Now, the primary source around this discussion is a Gemara in Masechet Shabbos, unsurprisingly, that says that classic cooking is done with fire, with eish. If I use another heat source, then this isn't classic cooking, and as far as Torah law is concerned, this is not a Torah prohibition of cooking. Now, you may say, what other classic heat sources did they have to heat things other than fire? And the answer is they had a whole array. And I'll just mention three of those discussed in the ancient world. One of those is the sun. You can use the sun to cook, to heat water, to fry an egg if you're in a hot enough part of the world. The second non-fire source they had for cooking was chemical heat, such as lime or rotting biomass, chemical heat. And the third source of heat that they had was from the Earth's core, which is Chamei Tiveria. It's referred to in halachic literature as the hot springs of Tiveria. Hot springs are naturally sulfuric heated water, from water which draws its heat from the Earth's core. And again, this is a non-fire sourced heat. And the basic principle the Gemara says is that as far as Torah law is concerned, such heat is not Bishul min HaTorah, is not Torah prohibition of cooking. Now, in application to modern day scenarios, the poskim speak about electrical elements and microwaves. These are two commonly used heat sources. which don't easily fit the classic definition of fire as far as halacha is concerned, and the poskim discuss this. But before I talk about these, I need to share one more piece of information. The Gemara says that cooking from the heat of the sun is not fire, and therefore one can do so on Shabbos. It's mutter to do so on Shabbos. But once I have what the Gemara calls told us chama, heat, which is the offspring of the sun, that I can't do on Shabbos midrabanan. Meaning to say, if I want to heat water up directly in the sun, I can do so. But if I wish to heat water up in, for example, on a sheet of metal heated by the sun, then I can't do so. And the reason for this distinction is clear. When I heat something up on a fire, the heat source is fire. When I heat something up on the sun, the heat source is the sun. But once I'm heating something up on the metal sheet heated by the sun, I don't see the direct heat source. I just see the hot metal sheet. And therefore, rabbinically, I can't heat up on it, even though it derived its heat from the sun. So if you are in a desert and you need to cook food on Shabbos, you can do so directly in the sun. But you couldn't, for example, do so on the bonnet of your broken down car. You couldn't fry an egg on that because that'd be heating it on the metal heated by the sun. So just to summarize what we've said so far, heat sources other than fire, what were they in the ancient world? Chemical heat sources like lime or rotting biomass, sun or solar energy, what we call solar energy nowadays, or the earth core, chamei tiveria, hot springs. As far as Torah law is concerned, one can cook on them. However, rabbinically, the tolda, the metal sheets heated by them, one can't cook on. Okay, so let's apply these to the modern scenarios of metal elements and electrical elements, I should say, and microwaves. So electrical elements gets down to the debate about how we categorize electricity, which I spoke about when we discussed the malacha of havara, of lighting fires on Shabbos. I'm not going to go through the whole discussion again, we discussed it there. But very briefly, the Chazon Ish was of the opinion that an electric current and heat element should be viewed in halacha as fire, as eish, because after all, it brings fire into the world, and the technology is the movement of electrons, the fast movement of electrons, akin to what fire is. So Chazon Ish was of the view that electrical elements should be viewed as eish, in which case he would hold that cooking on an electric element is Torah transgression of Bishul. Other poskim, primarily Rabbi Zobin Auerbach, disagree with this analysis, and they hold that an electrical element would not be eish, and therefore would hold that this is only a rabbinic prohibition. I say only in the sense that it's not Torah prohibition, and therefore perhaps the relevance in hospital scenarios or army bases, but of course categorically and absolutely forbidden on Shabbos, absolutely no doubt about that, even though it may not be Bishul min HaTorah. So this is electrical elements, according to the analysis of the Chazon Ish and Rabbi Zobin. However, there is another halachic discussion, and this was around microwaves. And this is a very famous teshuvah of Rav Moshe Feinstein, in which Rav Moshe Feinstein argues that microwaves cooking would also be prohibited as far as Torah law is concerned. And the reason he says so is because we need to understand, why is it that the Torah says that only cooking on fire is forbidden, or the Gemara understands halacha, and not other forms of cooking? And there's two ways to understand it. Either because fire is a normal way of cooking, but cooking from the sun or from chamei tiveria or lime or chemical or hot springs is an unusual way of cooking, and that's why it's not forbidden as far as Torah law is concerned. The second way of understanding it is that since we learn the malachas from the Mishkan, we learn that the fundamental use of fire is the way to cook, and other forms of cooking are not the Torah prohibition of cooking. Now, what would be the difference between these two ways of conceptualizing it, two models? The difference would be what happens if I have a normal or become normal way of cooking that isn't fire. Argues Rav Moshe Feinstein, who was shown a microwave in the 70s, that this is fantastic, this is remarkable. It was new cutting-edge technology at the time. Rav Moshe says in a prescient insight, I've no doubt this is going to take off. This is going to become a very normal way of cooking. And therefore, this would become Bishul min Torah. It's true it's not a fire source. And in the time of the Gemara says anything non-fire isn't a normal way of cooking, but times change. And now this has become a normal way of cooking, and therefore this would be prohibited as far as Torah law is concerned. And by that analogy, Moshe also wouldn't be interested as to whether electric elements are fire or not, as per the discussion of the Chazon Ish of Rabbi Zobin and Arbach, because he would say, at the end of the day, this is a normal way of cooking, and therefore this would also be prohibited by Torah law, because it has become a normal way of cooking. So argued Moshe. In fact, Moshe said that he suspects that once microwave technology is rolled out, people won't even bother with normal heating elements and normal ovens. We know that part of his prediction has not come true, because the cooking of microwaves is different to regular fire cooking, and therefore it's useful for warming things up and heating potato cooking, some things, but not for other forms of cooking. And this is really precisely the point, because those who argue with Moshe say this isn't correct. Fire creates a certain sort of cooking experience. The other heat sources create a different sort of cooking experience. And as far as Torah law is concerned, the crucial cooking that's prohibited is when I use fire to cook. Anything else used to cook isn't the form of bishul that's prohibited in Torah. A microwave, it is true, converts raw food into cooked food, but it still is very different to something cooked over fire. This is not the Torah prohibition of cooking. So just to summarize, modern technology remains somewhat contentious. There would be two reasons why you might forbid a modern day electrical heating element or microwave. The first would be if you believe it's another form of fire. Electricity is conceptualized halachically. It's a separate physical force, but which one is it analogous to in halacha? It's fire, as per the Chazon Ish's argument, in which case that would be Torah prohibition. Or as per Moshe, because this is a normal way of cooking. Those who argue, primarily with Rabbi Zobin and Arbach and many other Israeli poskim, disagree. And they say, no, neither argument is correct. Electricity and microwave should not be viewed as eish in halacha. And these are maybe normal ways of cooking, but they're different ways of cooking to fire. And the Gemara teaches us that it's only fire cooking, which is bishul as far as Torah law is concerned. By the way, in Israel, I should add, it's become very normal to cook, in a sense, using solar energy, because every Israeli house has solar panels and water is heated up. So according to Moshe Feinstein's analysis, one would wonder whether cooking with the sun nowadays would also have become a normal form of cooking, therefore being a problem, whereas the Israeli poskim by and large are convinced this is not the correct analysis. In practical halacha, again, I want to emphasize, in normal life, this argument is of no relevance. Why not? Because either way, it's certainly prohibited, whether deraisa or drabanan. Bottom line, it's prohibited, and anyway, in operating electrical elements and microwaves, one is switching on and off electricity, and there's many other concerns that are relevant. However, this is very, very important in the context of emergency situations, in the guidelines given by the poskim in Israel, particularly in running, for example, army bases and hospitals that consult halachic authorities as to how to run on Shabbat in the best halachic manner, heating food for ill people, soldiers and things like that. That's where the more detailed analysis of understanding fire and what counts as fire in halacha is relevant. So this is a discussion around heat sources as per the question that was posed in the chat group last week. We've discussed what the outcome of Bishul is. The answer is changing from hot to cold with liquid, cold to hot with liquids, or from raw to cooked with solids, and we've defined those terms. Now we're discussing the process, and the process the Gemara says is fire, but what's included in fire in modern technology, and whether this is determined by normality or not, remains unresolved. Okay, how is this relevant to us in day-to-day life, given that either way, we can't cook with a microwave or an electrical element? And the answer is, and I'll conclude with these introductory words because we will look at this in more depth next week. This is the secret to understanding the very difficult halachas of Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni and Kli Shlishi, the first, second, and third order utensil. And I just want to explain very briefly what this concept is, why it poses so many difficulties to the way we think, and what the halachic understanding is behind it. And then next week, we'll look at this in more detail. So first of all, the facts of the matter. A pot, let's say full of water, cooking on a flame is referred to in halachic literature as Kli Rishon, the first utensil, because it's the utensil being directly heated, and it's Al Ha'esh, it's on the fire. If I take the pot off the flame, it's still a Kli Rishon, it's still the first utensil, the utensil heated. Shana Al Ha'esh, that's not on the fire. If I then pour out of that pot, that's called Iroi Kli Rishon, pouring out of the first utensil. And when it lands in the next utensil, that's called Kli Sheni, the second utensil. From the second utensil, if I pour it, it goes into Kli Shlishi, a third utensil, and so on and so forth. Now, we will see next week that these distinctions are important in terms of cooking on Shabbos. However, we struggle with these distinctions. Why should it make a difference whether it's Kli Rishon or Kli Sheni if it's piping hot? In fact, there's a paradox here, and I just want to spell out this paradox. A Kli Rishon, first utensil, that was on the fire in which the liquid was cooked, and I've let it cool down till it's 60 degrees. It's above Yad Seletes, so it's still above the level of cooking. It's hot. It's not very hot, 60 degrees, 50 degrees. Some people have their baths at 50 degrees, people that want hotter baths. It's hot, but not boiling hot. Nonetheless, Torah law considered potential bishul. Why? Because it's a Kli Rishon, the first utensil. Scenario number 2, I pour out of the Kli Rishon into a Kli Sheni, but it's still 90 degrees. So it's super hot, near boiling water, 95 degrees. But I've poured it from one utensil to another utensil. We say, no, this is a Kli Sheni. It has much more lenient rules. Again, we will see next week what the lenient rules are, what's the difference between Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni. But if cooking is about heating, at least with liquids, and even with solids, it's about affecting a change, surely the only criteria is heat, temperature. Why should it matter whether it's a Kli Rishon or a Kli Sheni? So this is the big puzzle, conceptual puzzle in Hilchos Shabbos. And the answer to the question is exactly what we've just been talking about. Because cooking is only problematic when it's from the fire. The Kli Rishon has its heat source from the fire. The Kli Sheni has its heat source from fire originally, but what warms up the second utensil? The food that now has heat in it, which it originally got from the fire. If you like, it's a grandchild of fire. A Kli Shlishi is a great-grandchild of fire. At some point, it becomes ever further removed from fire, and it crosses the halachic threshold. And now we look at it and we say, this isn't cooking with fire. This is like cooking with solar energy, or like cooking with chemical heat, or like cooking with hot springs. This isn't close enough to fire, and therefore it ceases to be bishul. So with this, we will conclude that we need in each case to understand the nature of bishul. Bishul means cooking with heat transfer. By the way, this is one of the reasons why microwave, as I said, according to many poskim, may not be Torah bishul, because even with electrical elements, you're transferring heat from elements to the food. With a microwave, it generates the heat within the molecules of the food product itself. So we always need to look at where the heat is derived from. A hot Kli Sheni, 95 degrees, in a second utensil, is where the heat source is a grandchild of fire. It's 2 stages removed from fire. The fire heated the liquid heated the pot in the Kli Sheni. In Kli Rishon, it's the child of heat, it's the pot heated by the fire itself. So it is true that in the Kli Sheni, it might be very hot, 95 degrees, and yet we'll say this is too far removed from fire, perhaps. Whereas in the Kli Rishon, it may still be lukewarm, only hot, but not very hot, 50 degrees, and yet we'll say this is enough because it's the Kli Rishon. So we can only understand the halachic concept of Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni, if we understand that it's about food's relationship to heat sources that matters over here, rather than just the outcome of how it was cooked. Next week, we will look at this in detail and actually understand what are the halachas of Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni, but this is the conceptual framework of why there's an idea of Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni. I'll stop there. We've now been on a tour of which heat sources count, fire or other heat sources. We've spoken about modern technology, and finally we've ended up with a classic halacha of Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni, about which we all struggle till we understand the concept behind this. I wish everyone a good evening, and I'll hang on in case there are any questions. But with that, I will conclude the shiur. Have a good day, and thank you again so much for joining.